Welcome, Dr. James Beckett, Sports Card Insights. Today's episode is a father-son, the second one, with Shane Zaiger, Bob's son. Bob passed away about 2 years ago. My dad passed away a year ago. Shane and I had an extended conversation about the hobby and about the generational transfer. Very enjoyable. I see Shane at the shows as he gets around, an Iowan. Thanks sponsors, Topps Panini, Upper Deck, Heritage Auctions, Huggins & Scott Auctions, Mike Stadium Sports Cards, ComC.com, and Beckett Media, Beckett Grading, Beckett Authentication. Thanks, Shane, and thanks, listeners, and here it is. I've been wanting to do an episode with you anyway, but since my dad passed away a year ago, I think your dad passed away maybe 2 years ago. So all these times until last year, I had my dad and talked to other people's whose dads were around for the most part, but just want to have good memories of your dad. I never did a tribute for your dad. I really didn't know him that well, but I knew he was a nice guy. But I know you miss him. I miss my dad. I got a great legacy from my dad, and I'm supposing you got a great legacy from your dad too.
Certainly, yeah.
I always saw your mom and your dad, it seemed like, at most of the shows. They were pretty much a team, but I don't remember you being there when you were little, were you? When they were circuit?
Yeah, it would have depended what show you were at. The reason you always saw them together, similar to some of the other couples in the Midwest, this is a hobby for my dad. He wasn't really a collector. It was just something to go out and do. He wasn't like a set builder. He wasn't stockpiling any run of anything in particular. This was really a way of my dad and mom hitting the road to see family and the friends they'd made in the hobby dating back to the late 70s.
There were lots of couples like that in and around that same age.
I started setting up at shows when I was 7 in 1986. My first show I ever did, I had an 84 Donners Mattingly stolen. That was a good teaching moment. You live and you learn when you're a second grader setting up at card shows. But yeah, we always did things together. And there was a lot of times I was on the road with my dad without my mom too, because my little sister was born in 1984. So if a grandparent wasn't available to watch her, mom would stay at home starting around that time. Our regular spots were a 4-hour drive from main shows in the Midwest, the Kansas City show every year, the shows in St. Louis, the shows in Milwaukee, the shows in Chicago. And then we ended up in Texas because my dad had a sister in Houston. So we did Larry and Betsy's shows and then Wanda's shows. So we were in Texas a fair amount too, which is probably where we crossed paths with you the most, that and the National, I would imagine.
Did they go to Hawaii some?
They did. Yeah. In fact,
I think I remember that.
Yeah, that's actually, if you went to that every year, they went to Kit's show for the first time in 1990. Then the going to the show part became an afterthought. That became my parents' second home. My dad worked until he was 72, but he had 3 months of vacation time. And they would go to Hawaii for at least a month every year, probably close to 25 years in a row.
Pretty awesome over there. My parents were living over there for some of that time, and I was obviously close friends with Kit, so I was over there more than once a year, it seemed. And that's paradise over there. I know your parents appreciated that. Wow. And Iowa is a great place, mainly because of the people. People don't like the Texas climate either, but I've never met anybody from Iowa that I didn't like. The Midwestern spirit is great.
Yeah, when we were around people, and not even just Iowa people, all the shows we did in the Midwest, it was the same thing. Texas really wasn't that different. I've loved my 45 years in Iowa, but I don't want to live here forever. I've been in Cedar Rapids my whole life.
They really seem to be in sync. Some of those early years I was single, then I was married, but when I was single, I was observing these married couples that were my age, maybe slightly older. And if you have harmony when you're on the road, sitting behind a table the whole weekend with a big smile, that speaks volumes. And your parents seem to be enjoying it.
Yeah, they're very much. My mom was definitely there to be around her friends, but absolutely had no problem working shows. In fact, when our retail store opened in the mid-90s, she worked 3 to 4 days a week in the store. When that was definitely gritting your teeth and bearing it. She didn't want to be doing that. But as far as the shows go and she could be around friends, that was definitely her happy place. She's friends with a lot of those women still today that are still around. It was just shows from 84 to 94. Then we opened the retail store in 94, which stayed around in one form or another until when he got out of the hobby.
When he got out, did you get even more in, or did you step away for a while too?
2008, of course, was a bad financial year in the country. And it was made doubly worse here because we had massive floods here in the Cedar Rapids area. If your home wasn't destroyed, chances are your job got displaced. It was a mess. So that was on top of the pile. And we had decided in January of 2009 we moved to online only. We'd been on the Beckett marketplace and had a really large eBay account for 4 years. We'd been moving towards online. There were some other reasons too. We were moving away from retail, and the sell down process took us over 2 years to just move through stuff that had value to make him whole. While at the same time, my wife was pregnant with our youngest. And that 2 year period where I'm just basically trying to fill my dad's coffers and think about my own future, I was completely burned out by 2011. So I'm 45. I think from 2011 to 2014 was the furthest I ever was away from the hobby. 2 small kids, a wife that had a career going. And I liked what I was doing, and I couldn't have been happier to get away from the hobby for a while, which I'd been around my whole life, basically.
Was your dad encouraging you or discouraging you, or did your dad just see that this was a season of life? Because you had a lot invested in by then, and so did your dad.
I took over running the business when I was a senior in high school. My dad got the retail store going. A lot of the credit I can give my dad about who I am in the hobby can be attributed back to that 10-year period before the retail store opened. Once the retail store opened, it was more about just school of hard knocks and learning things and asking for advice from time to time. But I had the template just being, at card shows when I was 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 years old. And this is the woulda, shoulda, coulda when your parents are no longer around. I've had so many questions just thinking about stuff in the last few years where I'm like, I don't know if we ever had that conversation. I don't know why I did this, or he said that, or he suggested this, or I was thinking the other day when knowing what we were going to talk that I don't even know what his original motivation was for opening the store in the first place.
Do you think it could have had a father-son component to it?
I want to say yes, but at the same time, I was still in high school, and there is a extra level of stress. I think people in the restaurant biz go through this more than anything else, but living with your parents when you are running a business with them and can never get away from them, because we're talking pre-internet era, pre-cell phones. They had a lot of trust in me. I played hockey and baseball and would go out and do whatever, whenever. And they had the trust in me to leave the house at pretty much from the time I had a driver's license. But I really don't know. I wish I do. My mom's at the point now where I could ask her and she may not even really know the answer or the thought process. Because that was always interesting to me that we got the store going, but he never really worked at it. He still wanted to go to shows until the early 2000s. They went to every national. They quit doing Kit's show once he sold it to, right. And those were actually my first ones. My first one going solo was in 2000. And I think that might have been the year that Kit sold the show. But my dad, a lot of what I learned from him in the best way forward to not just running a business, but just being around people and doing things the right way, I can definitely attribute to my early teenage years with him.
You didn't go through a rebellious streak?
My rebellious streak was in my early 20s when I got out of the house and really had nothing to do with the hobby or my parents. I was never troubled or anything of that nature. I was always amongst friends as a teenager and into my early 20s, the one that would make the right decisions.
I don't mean like defiantly rebellious. When you have a dad that's a good example, then sometimes you think, I'm just going to follow that example. Or sometimes you think, I'm going to do a little different. But I think you had a good example. I had a good example. The example was that if you work hard, you'll be rewarded. You're not necessarily going to get rich, but you're going to have a good life if you do things the way they're supposed to be done.
That's very true. The kicker between my dad and I is there wasn't a ton of that communication. After a while, it just became, he trusted me. He laid a foundation that allowed me to grow when I wasn't in the hobby and I was teaching management and other industries, that being a self-starter and trusting your gut sometimes is the way to go. I definitely got my first entrance into that working for my dad.
I think it was unusual in my family. I was the oldest of 5 kids, and we talked a little bit about business and school and current events and things at the dinner table. My dad, I think, was a good communicator, but then he had to divide by 5 kids plus a wife. But a lot of issues came up, and it was about treating people right. And I'm sure your dad, if he didn't explicitly say that, I witnessed him being a straight shooter. And it's one of the greatest gifts a dad can give to a son, to see that if you treat people, you're more often than you're going to get taken advantage of occasionally, but you're going to sleep better at night, and you're more often than not, you're going to do well.
People like my dad, even if you are talking about the hobby in the 80s or any other hot time or even in the last 5 years. And I understand why both these things exist, because to be successful, you have to be a little bit greedy and a little bit pretentious, especially in today's world where self-promotion and social media is so important. Fanatics is basically telling hobby shops they have to do now, which is really probably scaring the remaining people from my dad's generation that are still running hobby stores. But the treating people right aspect of this is something that I've witnessed so often over 40 years. If people would just operate a business, even if it just is a hobby with some, ethic or moral standards. And yet my entire background growing up and then running our retail store was just always doing things the right way, even if it meant not cutting any corners ever to getting to a finish line. That's just never how we operated. Now I've been in this space as a full-time job so much of my adult life. Now I know where the lines are, whereas it was just a hobby to him. I feel like sometimes I'm the finished product of something that he probably could have done as well, but just chose not to. And I had no problem doing those things and having those conversations with people that, to be quite honest, he probably didn't have any interest in it to begin with. My dad worked at Rockwell, which is now Collins Aerospace, for 52 years. From 1992 on, they had a messy union contract renewal in which my dad didn't like the outcome. From that point on, my dad didn't want to deal with bosses. So he took every opportunity he could to work second shift or gravy, which immediately cut down on the amount of things he could do with family because he messed with his sleeping patterns. And I never begrudged him. I understood it. I was old enough in 92 when he went through that to understand where his head was. But my sister was 5.5 years younger than me and probably didn't understand it all.
You're talking about this nice guy that I only saw on the weekends, and he had a smile on his face. And when you're in the hobby, you're really are an independent business person.
Yes.
He had his lovely wife with him almost all the time, it seemed like, and going to nice places, like you said. And if he was like me, you came back with more money than what you left with.
Yeah, and it's funny too. I wanted him to collect more because some of his friends in the hobby were big time collectors. Dave Bradley was a massive memorabilia collector. Tom Daniels had an absurd collection as far back as I can remember. Those were some of his best friends in the hobby as far as people we'd hang out with or to go do shows with. But yeah, it was just sell. He'd buy stuff occasionally, but it had nothing to do with being a collector. He's just spending time doing what he enjoyed doing.
Chris Sewell is a collector, investor, dealer in that order. Are you thinking you're more of a dealer now and your dad was more of a dealer?
I actually took after my dad unintentionally in this way. I actually had a method to my madness even as a teenager. We opened the store in 94. I was going around shows 92, 93, 94. And when the store opened for the first couple of years, I was a big time collector. I collected Ty Domi, Mark Messier, Jeff Bagwell, and Richard Petty cards. New York Rangers have been my team in sports since I was 11, and I was a big Jeff Bagwell fan. I can't attribute this to my dad, but I made the decision. I was a senior in high school, and I had a really short schedule, so I could run the store if I wanted to. By that point, the only sport I was still playing was hockey. I remember I just cut collecting cold turkey, and I haven't collected since I was 17 years old. Now, on my ComC accounts listed as not for sale, do I have a lot of really awesome Richard Petty autograph hard sign cards? Yes, I do. And I explain that as I own it, so I collect it. If I sell it, I have a little bit of that. But I very much viewed this as a means to retirement for no other reason other than I've accumulated this database of what a lot of people refer to as useless information. It goes back to being at card shows and just learning and being a sponge. And that's the way my dad was too. He'd get around friends and he'd be goofy and he'd be a talker, but just as a default setting, he definitely was not. He was more of a, you can't learn anything while you're talking type of a person. That's where that started for me and has just carried on. Did we end up being the same type of person when it come to being a collector? Probably, but we definitely got there in two completely different ways.
Well, a big part of it probably, because my dad impacted me in a similar way, but it sounds like your dad stated desire to not work for somebody. You're your own boss. You pick your own hours. My dad, even though he was in corporate America for the first major part of his career. I didn't find out till later he really wanted to be an entrepreneur, but he had these 5 kids he had supported. So some of the dinner conversations and other conversations were, what if you were in charge? What would you do? Things like that. So he encouraged me and my siblings to think about how you would handle things. You're your own boss. I became my own boss. And that's not for everybody. But when you see it modeled in your dad, you say, I can do this. If you're a self-starter, you can do it.
Absolutely. I think the key is the self-starting part. That's really where it gets going. And what's funny, my kids and my wife all the same way. That's really hard to teach. Because
it's not taught, it's caught, it's observed.
Yep.
You try to teach them, say, hey, kids, this is what you need to do. They push back. But if they just observe your consistency, and again, you've got to have a smiling countenance that you're not grumbling that, this is terrible. What's terrible is somebody telling you to do stuff you don't want to do. So I love the hobby. And I guess I want to editorially say that even if you're a lifer, you're allowed to slow down or take a break for a little while. Because it's not just for mental health. It's good. You're not totally leaving, but you're taking a step back just for therapeutic reasons. But deep down, I'm a lifer, and I may reduce my pace, but I'm looking forward to participating for many more years.
The